While many countries around the world are in the process of recovery after its economy was brought to a halt by the first wave of COVID-19, the fear of the outbreak of the second wave of the virus is beginning to take its toll on investments. In October 2020, Nigeria recorded a total of $900 million in its foreign direct investments, where capital inflow declined by 71.4%. Now, as a result of tight global financial conditions, capital importation data showed that inflow declined to $190 million in the review period. Now below $670 million in September 2020, a disaggregation of inflows in the review period showed that foreign direct investments at $90 million, I beg your pardon, accounted for 45.8% of total inflow. Foreign portfolio investments at $10 million accounted for 5.6% of total inflow, while other investments, largely in form of loans, were $90 million, accounting for 48.6% of the total inflow. With almost a 500 million reduction in capital inflow from the preceding months, what policies are necessary for the country's economy to catch up with the pre-COVID times? I have joining me now to discuss this. Lagos is an investment research analyst with United Capital PLC, Mr. Ayorinde Akinloye. Mr. Akinloye, I thank you so very much for your time.
Hi, Tolu. Thank you very much for having me today. Grateful to be here.
All right. Great one there. Mr. Wednesday earlier mentioned your role also in the accusation, but that's on the other side. United Capital is also doing very well. Now, according to UNCTAD 2020 World Investment Report, FDI flows to Nigeria totaled $3.3 billion in 2019, showing 48.5% decrease compared to the previous year. Now, the total stock of FDI was estimated at $9.8 billion in 2019. Some of the main investing countries in Nigeria include USA, China, United Kingdom, Netherlands, and France. With the second wave of COVID-19 hitting the global economy harder, what is your forecast in terms of volume? What would we see quarter after quarter?
Okay, yeah, so basically right now for capital importation, we think that capital inflows from foreign investors will still remain largely depressed, considering heightened macroeconomic concerns, relating to the COVID-19 pandemic, basically. And like we saw, for example, in October 2020, we had just about $90 million in terms of inflows into the country for FDI, basically. And even in terms of other components of capital importation too, they are not doing all that well, considering the fact that there are still issues regarding FX and all, basically. Now, where do we see FDI closing the year at? We recall that between January and February, we had a decent level of foreign inflows into the country, and also in Q3. In Q3, because of some strategic acquisitions, particularly in the fintech space, we had that slight bump. But looking through for the rest of the year, we expect that capital importation would still be very much depressed. And, definitely October was a record low, but we expect that the amount of inflows would definitely recover slightly above what we had in October 2020. So probably back to the levels of between about 100 to 150 million that we typically were having after the COVID-19 pandemic struck. So basically, that's the range that we'll sort of be looking at on a monthly basis.
Now, before I go to my next question, you touched on something very important, FX issues. We've seen all moves by the Apex Bank to try to bridge this gap, but seems not to be working. We still have this disparity when it comes to rates and all that has been happening, even at the I&E window compared to the parallel markets. What do you make of this before we move to the next question?
Okay, yeah, so basically, regarding the FX issues that we have, generally, we know that the FX challenges that we have in Nigeria they are structural, and they are issues that date far back. And we look at the fact that this basically stems from our over-reliance on crude oil for FX receipts. Looking at what happened last year, following the decline in crude oil prices, and then the fact that we had to cut our oil production, as part of our compliance with the OPEC Plus alliance agreement, that, led into significant decline in our FX earnings. Now, as a result, which is typical of what, for example, what we had in 2015 and 2016 when crude oil prices declined significantly, and then we're also having issues with oil infrastructure installations in the Niger Delta, and as a result, production also declined. So basically, these are similar rhetorics that we've been having over the years, and basically, the CBN has been profiling the same solutions to basically manage the problem until there is a recovery in oil prices. So, for example, how did we see the CBN react last year? They started to ration the limited amounts of FX that they had available, basically just to conserve and protect the external reserves, basically. Now, as a result of that, what that happens is all the demand that should be met or satisfied at the investors and exporters window will be moved to the parallel markets. And when that amount of demand falls into the parallel markets, then you will definitely expect to see a spike in parallel market rates. So when you look at the premium, the premium at which the dollar trades to the naira in the parallel markets, you would always observe that spike whenever we get into a situation like this, similar to the rhetoric we had in 2015, 2016, 2017, until we began to see that the I&E window converge with the parallel market rates in 2018, down into 2019. And that was as a result of improved FX flows from oil prices, capital importation, particularly in terms of FX inflows from foreign portfolio investors, improved. And as a result, CBN had more dollars to be able to intervene in the markets. But so still down, so everything, all the FX issues and the challenges that we continue to have every time there is an oil crisis is still tied to the fact that about 90% of our export earnings is tied to oil and oil production and oil price. And as long as that continues to be the case, then Nigeria will definitely continue to have issues with FX. We continue to have FX issues whenever there's any oil crisis and going forward. So there's an urgent need to basically ensure that export earnings, we diversify export earnings away from just the oil sector, basically. And also, there's also a need to ensure that we can attract solid foreign direct investment inflows that would stay in the country for longer periods, rather than attracting foreign portfolio investments that come into the country, and then after a while they have to leave the country once their investments are over, or they feel that there's any sign of trouble, and then we begin to get pressure on FX from foreign investors who want to move out their investments into the country, who want to move them out of Nigeria, and then we begin to face those FX issues all over again. So those are the key things that we need to put in place to ensure that this rhetoric does not continue whenever we experience any significant downturn in the oil market.
Now, beyond the drop recorded in foreign direct investment, we also saw foreign portfolio investment, that's FPI, and other sundry investment by mid-year 2020 drop. By sectors, marketing sector recorded a rise from $1 million to $1 million, from $80,000 in quarter one 2020. Top 5 sectors with the highest recorded capital inflows in quarter 2 were shares of $464.57 million, financing $309.48, banking, and production. Now, how do we develop infrastructures to milk new cash cows we see in emerging and new sectors of the economy?
Okay, yes. So basically, right, alluding to what I mentioned earlier regarding attracting solid FDI inflows. For example, we look at the data for October, and then we see that foreign direct investments fell to $90 million. That's a record low when you look at historical flows on a month-on-month basis. Yes. Now, even prior to the COVID era, there was, that significant drive for the federal government to put in place policies to improve the business environment so that Nigeria would be able to compete with other markets, other countries in the emerging markets and in sub-Saharan Africa, so that we'll be better placed to compete with them for inflows from foreign investors for long-term business developments, basically. And that was because FDI flows into the country, were much smaller compared to what we had in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, before we started to have the recession of 2016 and all the oil crisis like that. Since that point, foreign direct investments have not recovered. And basically, that's been down to long-standing issues that have affected the business environment. Now, as you mentioned, infrastructure. One of the infrastructure deficit remains a key problem, a key reason why foreign direct investments in the country continues, to remain low. For example, the power sector. The power sector, yes, there have been lots of sound bites and talks around improving power supply and trying to get power supply up to par with other African countries, with other emerging market countries, who have more stable power supply, basically. But that has not produced any fruits over the past few years. Issues around the port infrastructure continues to, linger, and that has not been resolved. There are other ports that, could be used for some of the business operations in terms of for trade. But most of these ports are basically redundant and are not doing anything. So that the port infrastructure remains a major problem. So in terms of solving the infrastructure problems in the country, we need to focus. There's a need for the government to focus more on key infrastructure like power, ports, transport infrastructure. Basically, these three key things, will form a major part of improving investor sentiment towards the Nigerian market. For example, we can't clamor for investments in industrial processes and manufacturing if power continues to remain at where it is. Most of the industrial firms in Nigeria rely on, alternative power sources, generating their own power basically to keep operations running. And many of these alternative sources are definitely much more expensive than, using when you have normal power supply. So in terms of business, it impacts on your margins, it impacts on your return on equity. And these are the numbers that foreign investors will look at when they want to invest long-term in the country. They look at the fact that, to get stable power, you have to generate your own power. And for you to generate your own power, you have to make significant investments. That's lots of equity that you have to, invest to get, your business competitive enough to compete with, what obtains in other countries. So there's a need for the federal government to take on that responsibility of improving the power situation, of improving the ports, basically the port infrastructure, because when you produce, you definitely want to be able to move your goods out of the country in terms of being able to export to other countries, particularly when we have the AFTA agreements coming in play this year. That's like giving companies in Nigeria access to more markets across Africa. Now, if they are able to, so that means they can access more markets. If they're able to produce at reasonable cost levels, it means they can easily, by improving the ports infrastructure, they can easily move these goods out of the country, meet domestic supply, and at the same time still able to export and also generate more in terms of FX earnings for the federal government. And this still again speaks to what I mentioned earlier on diversifying the country's FX earnings from oil and gas, basically. So yes, power, ports, and transport, those are key things that the federal government must work on from an infrastructure perspective for investors to begin to look at Nigeria in the same light at which it looks at other peers across Africa in terms of business environments and ease of doing business, basically.
Beautifully said. Mr. Chloe, stay with your submission. Let's round up in the World Bank's 2020 edition of Doing Business report. Nigeria was ranked 131st worldwide for the ease of doing business. Now, this represents a leap from 2019 edition when the country was ranked 146th. The country has improved in many subcategories of the ranking, like according to them, starting a business, dealing with construction permits, electricity, which is key. You've identified that, registering property, trade across borders, and enforcing contracts. But in reality, some say there is still growing unease in the business climate. You've identified some, the ports and all of that. Let's now look at policy direction and legal framework that you think needs to be consolidated on.
Okay, yeah, so now the next thing, like I meant, when we spoke about infrastructure earlier on, the next thing that also continues to deter investors from looking at the Nigerian market, is basically our institutional framework. Institutions in Nigeria are not strong enough to enforce the law
The laws.
or to basically make the business process easy. For example, yes, we recall that sometime back, the vice president signed some executive orders in terms of improving enforcing of contracts and other things around the legal framework basically, and that basically fed sentiments that led to the increase in our ranking on ease of doing business. But when we look at our institutions, yes, the orders are there, the laws are there. That's not the problem. Yes, I mean, in terms of regulation, there are still issues regarding regulation, but to a decent level, there are levels of regulation and laws that we have in place. But the problem that we have, basically falls on the institutional framework that would enforce all these laws and all these regulations. So institutional framework in Nigeria is very weak, and there's a need for the federal government, or there's a need for the government at large, to empower these institutions to be able to basically enforce these regulations, enforce these laws, to the letter, and that would aid ease of doing business. Also, speaking to institutions still refers to the fact that the bureaucratic processes for you to get permits, for example, remains burdensome. So, you want to secure a mining permit, you want to secure permits. So all those, securing permits, particularly from government agencies, who are largely in charge of these things and are still part of the body of institution, in the business environment. The bureaucratic processes that you have to go through to get these permits also forms a key problem. And that is why you would always see foreign direct investments, continue to, taper out, and we'll continue to see foreign direct investments go down. Now, how do we resolve, the institutional problems? It's important for the government to ensure that the institutions are greater than, more or less like greater than, individuals, basically, such that regardless of who is there, the institutions can continually run and continually enforce the law, regardless of any business or anything, basically. So there's a need to ensure that independence. There's a need to ensure that objectivity in the institutional framework. And as long as those institutional problems continue to remain, then we'll continue to have issues with enforcing contracts. We'll continue to have issues with securing permits. We'll continue to have issues, regarding all the business processes and enforcing business laws, basically. And that will definitely continue to deter investors' interest in the Nigerian business environment.
A very good one there, Mr. Akinloye. If you can do this in 1 minute, I just want to take you away a little from this. What are you expecting? MPC meets on Monday. A lot of projections. What do you think from your end?
Okay, yeah. So for us, we expect the MPC to maintain status quo. Yes, last year they went all dovish last year, but we expect them to maintain status quo next week, basically because there's a need to watch the policies that they have put in place, permits the economy, and then they would also like to see the GDP numbers for Q4 2020, which we might not get until sometime in February. So we expect that the old status quo until we begin to see how well the economy is doing in terms of recovering from the recession of Q3 2020. So if we begin to see any sign of recovery into from Q4 and then down into Q1, then we can now begin to look at how the MPC will react to galloping inflation and continued, weakening of foreign portfolio inflows into the country. From that point, then we can now begin to make a case for tightening monetary policy. But for now, we expect them to maintain status quo to ensure that, the recovery of the economy is strong and solid before they now begin to change policy directions.
I must thank you so much for your time. Investment Research Analyst, United Capital PLC, Mr. Ayorinde Akinloye. I thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. Thank you, Tolu. Thank you for having me.